Hey everybody, it's Matt Daps from Wineskins. Just want to share a piggyback thought on the video a while back about the decline in Churches of Christ and want to give a suggestion that may give us a healthier option moving forward, a different way of thinking, a different paradigm about how we view church and what it is that we're actually measuring or counting when it comes to church. It's really important when we have this conversation that we're not just talking about how we count things, but about why we count things. And let me ask you this. Would you rather have a church of 800 people who were just kind of mundane, kind of filling the pew, filling the seat? Or would you rather have a church of 300, 350 people who were really on fire, who were really involved, really participating, who understood the mission and the vision and were on board 100% going after it? I know for me, I would much rather be a part of that 300 to 350 member church. And over time, you're going to watch those attendance figures from the 800 member to the 350 member church cross as the 800 goes into decline and the 3 to 350 member churches is going into their best days. Best days may be behind for one and ahead for the other. And so our trajectory is really, really important, but it's important that we measure the right things. This doesn't necessarily mean that we stop measuring, counting the things that we always counted. The two things that we've typically counted are attendance and contribution. And I think those things are actually still pretty important metrics, still pretty important things to measure. Ed Stitzer in Christianity Today at their website in 2014 had a statement and a couple things I'll mention later where he said, we count people because people count. I'll give that link here in the description down below. I think that's a really important comment, a really important idea, a really important statement. It's really important to count people. It's important to know kind of how many people are around and kind of keep track of that, just to have a general idea of that. It's an okay thermometer. It won't tell us everything we need to know, but it's not something that we should abandon or reject. Contribution, money, very important to track that. We need to know where that's at. We need to keep account of those things for responsibility of stewardship within our ministry. So don't stop counting those things. It's more so that I want to change our underlying philosophy about why we're counting the things that we're counting and maybe add a few new things to the list of what we're going to say are most important to us. And they're most important to us because we believe that counting these things are actually accounting for our biblical priorities and values. And so, our attendance doesn't tell the whole story. Just doesn't tell the whole story. I remember when I was in Florida doing ministry, we had a young adult ministry. And in that ministry, we had this Bible class that was growing and growing and maybe kind of filling out the room that we were even in. And so we started these new approaches to doing class where we would send people out to do ministry during Bible class time to go pray with shut-ins and do different types of ministry, write letters to people, write letters to prisoners, and et cetera. Bible class numbers went down. And the first week into that, I came in to teach class and I thought, oh, where's everybody at? And then it dawned on me, they're ministering, they're helping people, they're out there with people doing ministry in real time right now. We now have more people involved doing what's most important, but our Bible class number is less. So which metric is most important? We had something similar to this here in Auburn where we're doing an international readers program on Wednesday night, and my Bible class number on Wednesday night Bible class dipped when we have the reader program. And I thought to myself, how great is this? Our Bible class number has dropped. I would take 0 people showing up to Bible class and all those people going to read with international students and faculty to help them. Such an important thing that we understand that attendance is not an end-all measure, that there are other things that we should be measuring as well. We have to learn to count the right things. So before I get into what are those kinds of things, what are examples of that, and what are the underlying philosophy and underpinnings of those things, I want to give a little bit of a word of warning because sometimes when we start talking about changing the way we count or the things we count, that can actually kind of be code language for dysfunctionality, a lack of transparency. It's like we're looking at the numbers going, those numbers don't look as good as they used to. Let's count different. I remember being a part of some ministries that started shifting the things that they were counting, not because they had a better approach or wanted to account for more things, better things, push in new directions, better directions. It was because we were going to continue to do the same old things that we had always been doing, but the numbers were no longer panning out. And so it made more sense to some of the leadership to change the way that we accounted for things. This was years ago, not anything I've done recently. To change the way that we accounted for things rather than change the approach. That's dysfunctional. That's not a healthy thing. So when we talk about changing our metrics or changing what we're counting or why we're counting it, we need to really be in tune with our motives, that we have proper motives for this, that we're not just trying to hide some underlying dysfunction or have a pride issue, that we don't want people to see the numbers as they are. And so we start counting other things in new ways and don't have apples to apples anymore and comparing with the past. That is kind of a scary thing. And not necessarily a very ethical thing. And so if the metrics aren't going well, we don't just need to change the metrics just to have a better appearance. That's kind of manipulation. So let's not do that. So let's count the things that are right. And the things that are right come from a set of better priorities, a set of better values. Once we set our priorities, our vision, our values, and we have an intention to move in that direction, we need to start accounting for the things that make the most sense on how to assess where we are and where we're going and whether or not we're getting there, that these things are somewhat measurable. Some of the things will be qualitative rather than quantitative, but we can at least put somewhat of a quantitative spin on some of the things that really need to be examined and looked at. And then we can set goals and have some accounting or accountability of whether or not at least we're moving in the right direction. Some of these things are really hard to measure. You say spiritual transformation, how do you measure that? Ed Stitzer gives some thoughts on that I'm going to share in just a second. But some of that's going to be qualitative. But at least you can figure out some pieces of that you can measure and account for. That you may not have a precise measurement of the amount or percentage of growth, but at least you know it's moving in the right direction. Ed Stitzer, in that same Christianity Today article back in 2014, said that he thinks it's vitally important that we measure spiritual transformation. And the way that he goes about that are four things. He says we measure what percentage of the people in the church are serving. We measure how many people are serving inside the church and outside the church. We measure how many people are participating in small group ministry. And we measure how many people are being trained for leadership in the church. And that, he says, will quantify on some level the idea of spiritual transformation, the maturity of the body of Christ. And I think that's pretty good. I want to add a few of my own things that we could consider measuring. How about the number of people in discipling relationships? We may not perfectly get our mind around that, but at least we can put our finger on it enough to know that it's growing or declining. How about the number of people who are actually discipling people in the congregation? I think that would be vitally important to know and to spend time in conversation with those people, equipping, sharpening, and encouraging them in their ministry. And for many of us, that number is going to be very, very low. That with some intentionality and effort, we could have a goal of doubling that or tripling that, say within the next year or two and beyond, to have an exponential or multiplication factor on the amount of people discipling and being discipled. Here's another one. What is the total percentage of the budget that is going to outreach efforts and evangelism? And we have to be very careful how we define that. We could define that in many, many ways that we, again, this goes back to motive and intention and ethics and morality. We don't want to define outreach in such a way that inflates that number to make ourselves look good. We want to define that properly. We want to define it in a way that says these are ministries that are about other people, specifically to bring them to Christ. Okay? Or you define that how you think is best, how you think is most biblical, but at least define it in a way that doesn't allow us to pull other things under that umbrella and say, look, we're at 50% money going out, 50% money coming in spent on ourselves, and you want to determine as a leadership, like, what's the percentage that you think is sufficient? What's the percentage that you think God is calling you to on a percentage of money out, money in, and try to be raised, if it's not where you want it to be, trying to be raising that percentage on an annual basis, either through just an increase in budget or however you can make that work to challenge the church to give in such a way that gets you closer to that 50-50, that 40-60 outreach number in the budget. What are your number of community partnerships with organizations within the community? What are your number of baptisms in the last 12 months? And track that on an annual percentage. And sometimes we say, I really don't even want to count that because maybe our number is so low. We've had one or two. Go ahead and start counting that. Go back through your records and count that. Assess that. Account for where you're at on that. And then you can project out, like, here's where we want this to be in a year. And the reason that's important, we're going to spend more time on in a minute, is because once you say we want to double that, triple that, quadruple that in the next year, or 10 times that in the next year or two with a specific timeline, then you start creating things that enable that and equipping people to pursue and accomplish what the vision is that you think God is calling you to. What are the quality of your relationships with your neighbors, your direct neighbors in the community? That's a qualitative thing. You just have to kind of say, I think it's here and it used to be there. Is it moving in the right direction? How many new visitors are you getting? And when I ask that, I don't mean, well, you could count this, transfer church hopping people. What are the numbers of people who you have who are visiting, who are seeking, who are unchurched? Well, you could say de-church, not church hopping. What are your numbers of people like that? Is it moving in a healthy direction? Is it stagnating? Is it declining? Is it non-existent? What about resources giving to equipping? How many Bible classes do you have in a given quarter on Sunday and or Wednesday that are specifically geared toward equipping the body to minister? And here's the thought. Sometimes we need to have different purposes for different items. And when you look at Sunday morning Bible class, Wednesday night Bible class, Sunday evening, sometimes it's Bible study, Bible study, Bible study, and then you throw a sermon in that's Bible study. We need other things going on with that. And so maybe you take Wednesday night and you say, that's going to be our equipping night. If you want to be equipped for ministry, we have a selection of classes every Wednesday night that equips people for discipling, for evangelism, for serving, for learning how to teach, worship leaders, etc. And you have a track or a series of classes that are being taught to equip the body. Or maybe you do one on Wednesday and one on Sunday, but it's kind of nice to set aside areas with specific purposes. Just a thought, and you can play with that, think about how that might work out. But that then begins to increase some of the things that you're measuring, even like to say how many people are being trained to be equipped to do ministry in this church. Right now it may be very few, if any. You add that class and start adding that metric in of how many people are attending those classes we didn't used to have the class or who didn't used to attend, and you can start measuring those things and start having some achievable goals that you can reach that will actually help improve the health of the church life and the church body. So I think that's a pretty good start to a list. I would love to hear in the comments for you to list some of your own things that maybe you measure or think would be healthy to measure. I think this is really important because here's why. And you're going to say, like, what does this have to do with the decline of churches of Christ? Everything. Not because we're going to change the metrics to make our numbers look better. That's manipulation. But because in our minds, when we began tracking the things that we believe are most important, we then begin resourcing those things, investing in those things that we think are most important, casting vision in those areas and setting goals in those areas, and then begin setting out to attain those goals by putting processes, procedures, and people in place to begin improving those metrics, not because numbers are important, but because, like Stitzer said, but because people are important. And so this is going to help our churches become more healthy. If all you're doing is tracking attendance and contribution, you're going to have a harder time, I think, being healthier and a healthier church culture than if you begin assessing, like, what are our goals, what's our mission, what are our priorities and values, and how can we start assessing, accounting for where we are in the health of this church on these things. What sorts of things can we account for that would give us a glimpse and at least understand, like, our trajectory over time? If we're moving in the right direction, we're going down or going up. Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? And again, sometimes our temptation is to say, I don't want to measure these things because I don't want to see a bleak picture. I don't want to see a bad picture. How do you think it's going to get better? If we can't be vulnerable enough to put the truth on the table and assess it and then set some concrete goals to at least see if we cannot move the needle in the right direction. And secondly, our decline may not be as fast as we think it is if you begin measuring some of these things. We may actually be excelling in some things, or the people who are left may be more active, more involved, more participatory. The percentages of involvement may actually be going up. Sometimes as churches go in decline, like contribution per attendee actually goes up because people are still trying to meet that budget, and so your amount of sacrificial giving actually gets on the rise at times. That's possible, maybe not universal, certainly. Second, I believe that if we start paying attention to the right things, again, we will invest in those things, involve ourselves in those things, and watch those things improve, which then make us healthier. And the byproduct of that, or part of loading into all this, is our intentionality and our focus. And so this is going to help us grow in areas that we think are worth counting, things that we think are worth investing in, the things that really matter the most, that we start paying attention to the things that we think God is paying the most attention to, and that we learn to count the right things. And again, attendance is helpful, contribution is helpful, but it just doesn't give you the whole picture. What is God happiest about in your congregation? And is that and can we reflect that and share in that enthusiasm and excitement by looking at these things and kind of really getting a better picture of what's going on, rather than just does the room feel more full this week or less full, and what was the giving and those sorts of things. Again, helpful, but not really the whole picture. I want to say one more thing by word of warning on this, a little PS. It's really important that we don't operate out of our own strength. It's really important that we don't end up with a whole nother set of issues and problems based on the new things that we are accounting for. One of the things that can come up is this idea of trying to control things, trying to shift and maneuver things, and really trusting in our own ability to shift the numbers and to shift the momentum. This is all about trusting God, and the things even that we define that we believe we should be accounting for are things that we believe are things that God is calling our attention to, not just things that we think we can move or shape or shift. This is all about what God wants and discerning that through a prayerful process of discernment. And so we don't want to just shift to a new approach just in order to end up with a whole other set of problems. We have to really check our fleshliness and our temptations and desires at the door, so that some of the same issues don't creep in that just crept in with attendance and contribution, where we're comparing ourselves with others on just a whole new set of metrics. And so I think that's a really important thing to consider as we move ahead. What does God really want with this? And it may be things that actually make me a little uncomfortable, because it's pulling the layers back on things that I may not want people to see or hear or understand, because I may be tempted to put myself in the center of that and think that that reflects poorly on me, or that as we watch those things improve, that actually reflects on me and my ability to improve things or to change the situation. And so let us make sure that in all of this, that God is front and center. And so I really appreciate you watching this, and I hope this gives you a start of a conversation and some ideas. And again, don't just take my list, and I'll put the list in the comments so that you have to go back and watch it and find these things and write them down. You can copy and paste them, out of the description. And so I hope this is helpful to you, and I hope it starts a meaningful conversation that can get your church leadership looking in a positive direction, and hopefully bring some growth in the areas that really matter most. And it may not be reflected in your attendance for some time. In fact, when you get intentional and pick a direction and you begin looking and accounting for how we're moving in that direction, that may turn some people off. There may be some people you just have to bless as they kind of go out the door and say, hey, we hate to lose you. We want you here. We need you here. But if you have to go someplace else, we completely understand. That may happen. And sometimes our numbers go down before they go up. And so don't be discouraged in that. Keep being faithful. Keep praying about what God wants most and discern those things, and then begin moving in those directions, and just see what you can account for, just see what makes the most sense. But please don't be pride driven, and whatever new thing that you begin accounting for, don't let our motives and intentions go to a bad place in those things. So God bless, and I hope this is helpful. And if it is, we're going to continue to produce content like this for church leadership, for church health, for Bible study, equipping resources, good theology. And so I would love for you to subscribe. You can click this link right here. You can find that and just click subscribe, and make sure to check the alert for getting the emails that let you know there's new videos posted. We're going to post several a week, 2 to 3 a week. And so I hope that you'll tune in. God bless.